Welcome to the lineup. Today is October the 7th, 2021. I'm Barry Stagner, and a little bit of a heads up regarding next week's program. Very excited to have my good friend who I did this type of thing with many times for several years. Pastor Mike McIntosh is going to be joining me as we look at the events happening in the world from the lens of Bible prophecy. So Pastor Mike McIntosh, next Thursday night, that would be on October the 12th or 14th, 1 week from tonight. He will be in studio together with me, and we'll be talking about the things that we love to talk about, that which makes the Bible alive and living and powerful. And the Word of God tells us that the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So he's coming again. And Mike and I will be talking about the indications and signs that we talk about every week. Well, our first story comes from the Jewish News Syndicate this week. And it's interesting because it is pivotal. Even though it may be kind of a minor story, it's got major implications, and we'll connect a couple of those as we go tonight. But the headline reads from, again, Jewish News Syndicate, in a first, Israeli court backs silent Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. And Jerusalem Magistrates Court Judge Bila Yahalom ruled on Wednesday that the silent prayer of Jews on the Temple Mount is allowed, saying it cannot be deemed a criminal act. Well, my goodness, when is prayer ever a criminal act? The ruling was the first by an Israeli court to support Jewish prayer at the site, the holiest site in Judaism. And the Temple Mount complex also houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Shrine, the third holiest site for Muslims, making it the most volatile spot in Jerusalem. I think we could expand that out a little bit. It's the most volatile spot on the surface of the earth, and we know it's going to be the focal point of the tribulation at the midpoint when the Antichrist declares that he is God, and the instructions given to the Jews at that time during the tribulation: run, because literally hell is going to break loose on the earth in a fashion and form that has never been seen since men were on the face of the earth. Seeking to maintain the fragile status quo in the capital, Jews are barred from prayer there currently, and still the practice of silent prayer, devoid of any overt markings of religious ceremony, such as talit, or the prayer cloth that has the tassels hanging from it, and the tefillin, which is the phylacteries, has been taking place almost daily in the eastern part of the complex with the consent of the police, albeit informally. Judge Yahalom issued her ruling in an appeal by Rabbi Aryeh Lipo against a police ban on his visits to the Flashpoint site. Lipo's daily arrival at the Temple Mount indicates that this is a matter of principle and substance for him, Yahalom said, adding that footage of his prayer indicated that he was not in violation of current guidelines on the Temple Mount. We have shown that the protection of holy places law also applies to Jews, and the most sacred place for the people of Israel is the Temple Mount, Lipo said, referring to the legislation ensuring freedom of worship for all religions in holy sites across Israel. The police also wish me luck because we all understand it is time to fulfill the dream of the generations and serve God in Zion, Jerusalem, without fear. Now, obviously, there's going to be some negative reactions to this, and we'll talk a little about that. But if you've never been to Israel, if you've never been to Jerusalem, never been on the Temple Mount, let me share with you something that happened one year when we were there as we were going up onto the Temple Mount. When you cross the bridge and go onto the Temple Mount grounds itself, that 35-acre plot of land that is the hot spot of all the planet, you walk into kind of an open area, a quad area, if you will. And this one particular time, we were crossing over the bridge, just getting ready to step out where the Muslim women were meeting and the kids were playing soccer on the Temple Mount by the Dome of the Rock Mosque. And all of a sudden, a group of half a dozen or so Orthodox Jewish boys entered in from the side and got right in front of us and stepped out on the Temple Mount grounds, literally the next group of people in front of ours. Instantly, within seconds, there were screams. Now the children ran to their moms. The women began to chant Allahu Akbar, God is greater. And soon the men who were gathered at the bottom of the steps that lead up to the Dome of the Rock shrine, or the shrine where they say Ishmael was offered on a stone by Abraham, and the stone supposedly is inside of there. And the men who were gathered at the foot of the steps, standing in the shade, they began the same chant. It became extremely intense, literally in a matter of 10 to 15 seconds. And obviously, the temperature rose exponentially. Quickly, the men became agitated. And I have to tell you, I have no idea where those boys went, but they were gone and out of sight in seconds. And the Temple Mount Police shuttled them off somewhere. I don't know where, but it got really intense really fast. And so we would expect to see with this legal standing some kind of response from especially the Palestinians, and they absolutely are responding. And Memory TV reports that the Palestinian officials said China will lead the world and is on our side. Beijing will accept whatever we accept, but knows we want to make Israel swallow the poison one drop at a time, according to Fatah Central Committee member Abbas Zaki. China will soon lead the world, and it supports the Palestinian position, whatever it may be, according to Fatah's Central Committee. In a public address that aired on Palestinian TV on September 29th, Abbas Zaki called on the U.S. to reconsider its stance with regard to Israel or risk becoming irrelevant. The Israelis, he said, are murderers, and called them some vile names that I will not repeat, and agents of instability, while the Palestinians are messengers of peace. I know that there is a serious change in Europe and even in the United States, said Zaki, but he added, do not forget the emerging camp, which is on your side. Remember, he's speaking to the Palestinians, and that is the Chinese. China is going to lead the world, he said, and it proclaims there can be no stability and progress without the liberation of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Chinese, he continued, have said they will accept whatever the Palestinians accept. In other words, he continued, listen to this. If tomorrow we decide to be stubborn and demand Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, or all of Israel, it would be fine with them. Well, that indeed is their intention. You used to look at Palestinian school books for the kids to study geography. There's no Israel on the maps. It's Palestine. But they know us, they said, and they know we're not suicidal, that we want to make Israel swallow the poison one drop at a time. And the Israelis claim that their army is a defensive force. Oh, the wretchedness, he said, and that Israel is an oasis of democracy. But it turned out that they actually practice apartheid and that they are murderers while we are the oppressed ones. The world will once again discover that we are the messengers of peace, whereas the Israelis are the messengers of instability, and America should reconsider its stance or it will become irrelevant, he said. Now, remember, the Temple Mount is in East Jerusalem, captured by Israel in 1967 in the Six-Day War, been a point of contention ever since then, including today, and it's been illegal for Jews or Christians to go and pray on the Temple Mount. Again, the most sacred place in Judaism, an unmentioned place in Islam. It's not written about in the Quran. Jerusalem's not mentioned even once, so it's mentioned some 800 times in the Bible, and yet they lay claim to it being a holy site. Yet any Muslim scholar worth their salt will tell you that the faraway mosque that they claim the Dome of the Rock Mosque to be is actually in Saudi Arabia with Mecca and Medina, the other two holy sites. Now, the Times of Israel is reporting that Israel said to alert their embassies worldwide of possible Iranian threats. Israel has warned its missions around the world of a possible Iranian terror threat, a television report claimed on Wednesday, following the arrest of an Azeri national over an alleged plot to assassinate one or more Israeli business people in Cyprus. According to Channel 12 News, Israeli diplomats across the globe have been told to remain on high alert. The network also said 3 suspects in the foiled attack attempt in Cyprus, revealed earlier this week, are suspected of fleeing the island nation, and the channel didn't cite the source for that information. Iran has been behind repeated threats against Israelis and Israeli missions around the world over the years. And in March of this year, the National Security Council warned Israelis that they could be targeted by the Islamic Republic abroad. It said Iran was behind a bombing attack near the Israeli embassy in India in January, which did not, thankfully, cause any casualties. The Israeli government has blamed Iranian terror for last week's reported plan to kill billionaire Teddy Sagi in Cyprus. However, local media reported Wednesday that the Cypriot authorities do not believe Iran was behind the plot. They also said to be convinced that the would-be hitman's target in the plot was indeed Sagi. They're not sure of either. Some sources had claimed that the foiled attack was an assassination attempt against Sagi, linked to his business dealings, but the Israeli government on Monday blamed Iran and said Sagi was targeted only because he is a Jew, an Israeli businessman. Now, what we do know is that temperatures are going to escalate the more this story circulates about what this judge's decision was, or this judicial magistrate, about praying silently without any outward signs of prayer on the Temple Mount. This will be in the minds of the Jordanians and other Arabs that as a violation of the status quo. This will be another log on the fire, so to speak, regarding Iranian aggressions against the nation of Israel, and certainly the Palestinians will make their voice heard about that. So it is a major, major story, even though it was kind of a minor decision, a right decision. Obviously, what a ridiculous thing to have laws against praying in your own country on the most sacred site to your religious system. It's just unbelievable that this even had to go to court and that a rabbi had to get permission to pray, but yet he's still told how to pray. But we have to remember, I mentioned this some time ago when Naftali Bennett first became the first half of the prime minister during this particular session between elections, and he has taken some pretty aggressive stances in the past regarding a Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, Jewish rights on the Temple Mount. And I said back then, I expect that we're going to see some movement in that area. And here we go. We've got a major move where something that has been illegal according to Israeli standards is now being recognized, though it has to be done silently without any outward signs of prayer. But you know what's coming. The rights for full access and the other things that the Jews desire, and rightfully so, cannot be far behind. And this is going to be potentially a fuse to the powder keg we know as the Middle East. Israel Hayom is reporting that the IDF chief says Israel will pursue operations against Iran on all fronts. Lieutenant General Avi Kochvi stresses the importance of quality intelligence in the battle against the Iranian regime's nuclear aspirations and says Israel's operational plans will continue to evolve and improve. Israel will continue to conduct operations aimed at eliminating the Iranian threat on all fronts and at all times. IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Avi Kochvi said Tuesday, adding that the operational plans are evolving as we speak. And speaking at a ceremony in honor of outgoing Military Intelligence Directorate Chief Major General Tamir Hyman, Kochvi said that the Israeli Defense Forces and the intelligence establishment were working throughout the Middle East in order to curb Iran. Now, we have to remember that what they're talking about is the Iranian regime. They're talking about the Ayatollah and his cronies who seek the destruction of Israel. And I've said this before, and I think it bears repeating again. The Iranian people, the Persians of the Bible, are wonderful people. All the Iranians who fled in 1979 that came here to the United States. We've had engagements with many of them, and they're just a wonderful, a kind, a loving people who want to raise their family. And the Iranian young people, the population of people under 30 in Iran is some 45% of the population. They want to be part of the global community. They want to be able to raise their family. They want to be able to find jobs. They're sick and tired of their money going to support terrorism and to Iranian proxies around the world. They just want to have a life and live a normal life, yet they're being hindered from that by the people that are in power and control. So let's just make that clear. When we talk about Iran and we talk about their threats against Israel, we're not talking about the man on the street. We're talking about those in places of power. The All Israel News is reporting, are winds of war brewing on the Iranian border with Azerbaijan? And how are Israel, Turkey, and Russia involved? Now, I think the headline is the most important part of this whole package, because it does name those who are going to invade Israel from the north and puts them in partnership together. Certainly, Israel will be the source of the invasion or the point of the invasion. Turkey and Russia are going to come from that very direction with the Iranians into Israel, with the Sudanese and the Libyans in tow. Iran, the article says, launches large military exercise as Tehran becomes increasingly concerned Israel is spying from across the Azeri border. Late in September, Iran decided to hold its largest military exercise in 2 decades on its border with Azerbaijan, setting the Azeri military on high alert and launching a ripple wave of concern through Turkey, Russia, and south to Israel. But this Iranian display of artillery, drones, and helicopters seems to be less about Azerbaijan and more about Israel. While Baku and Tehran, the two countries' capitals, have historically maintained good relations, Iran is becoming concerned with an apparent Israeli presence in Azerbaijan. We have reminded our colleagues in Baku of this issue, and they said overtly and covertly that they would give warnings. Baku should not allow third parties to use its borders and territories. Funny that they would say that when they're inside of Syria, according to a spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry. We do not tolerate the presence and activity against our national security of the Zionist regime, there's the real issue, next to our borders, and we'll take any necessary action in this regard. Now, here they are in the city of Kenitra, 15 miles from the Israeli border, but they're saying we're not going to tolerate an Israeli presence on their northern border. In fact, Israeli drones have played a big factor in Azerbaijan's destructive war against Armenia last year. Even during the height of COVID, when civilian flights to Israel were limited, 4 Azeri cargo planes were jetting from Tel Aviv to Baku and sometimes to Ankara as fighting broke out between Azerbaijan and Armenia, according to an Israeli newspaper. So absolutely, there is a relationship, military relationship, that is, at least in the selling of hardware and military goods between Azerbaijan and Israel. And what makes this interesting is we've got the Arab Gulf states and most of the Sunni Arab states that are making overtures toward Israel, wanting to normalize relationships. But Azerbaijan is Shiite, like the Iranians. And so, having this kind of relationship is a double slap in the face, so to speak, to not just fellow Muslims, but fellow Shiite Muslims for Israel to be supplying them weapons. And of course, their concern is, could that be used against us? And with Israeli proximity to the Iranian border, are they gaining information against us through those means? So again, you've got tension, even though it's related to Azerbaijan and their relationship with Israel. The real issue is that Israel is on the northern border of Iran, just like Iran is on the northern border of Israel. Now, here's an interesting story. I think all of us are quite aware that our universities, by and large, and college campuses, and now high schools and even middle and elementary schools have become indoctrination centers. And we're seeing the rise, even within our own Congress, of members of Congress of the United States that are pushing for communism and Marxist practices to be implemented in our country. Basically, the government having everybody's money and distributing it equally amongst the peoples under the banner of democratic socialism. Well, listen to this article. I think this is interesting from the Washington Post. Russia's rising young communists pose an unexpected new threat to Putin's grip. A candidate for the Communist Party in Russia's parliamentary elections, Mikhail Lobanov, went overnight from being an obscure university math lecturer, again, the university being a means by which this is spread, to a new face of a rising threat to the Kremlin. He nearly derailed a high-profile pro-Putin candidate in southwest Moscow in last month's voting, and then Lobanov claimed his victory was stolen by authorities via an opaque new system of online voting. Imagine that, corrupt voting practices. Russia's Communist Party has long been known for its compliance, never threatening the Kremlin, and in return for state funding and perks. They've kind of looked the other way, the Kremlin that is. But some young communists and leftist allies did not get that memo. They're starting to behave like genuine opposition. That could bring an unexpected challenge for President Vladimir Putin. Already, his forces are waging a sweeping crackdown on critics, the opposition, activists, journalists, and human rights lawyers. The aim is to clear the deck so that he can run for office again in 2024, potentially ruling until 2036 under a constitutional change that Putin initiated. With a generation of elders fading, kind of like the greatest generation aging here in America, a new cohort of outspoken social media savvy communists is rising. They don't wave red flags or speak in the stale ideological jargon. They take issue with Putin's regime over corruption and poverty. What's the banners that are being waved here in America? Some have even protested in support of Putin's arch rival, the imprisoned opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. This is one of the really powerful tectonic plates in Russian politics that is beginning to shift, according to a London-based analyst, Mark Galeotti, an honorary professor at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies at the University College of London. As a new risk pops up, Putin's regime is retooling its whack-a-mole crackdown, arresting and detaining many communists and sending police to knock on Lobanov's door to show him that he is on their radar. Now get this. Lobanov, who is the popular candidate by the communist young people, calls himself a democratic socialist. That's a very term being thrown around on the halls of Congress here, and as well as our young people in this country. And people are becoming more and more mindful of this globalist mentality under the banner or the name of Marxism or communism or socialism. It's all the same thing. The government is God and distributes every person's needs equally amongst the masses, while what these young people don't realize today is what communism is a few people ruling and living richly and everybody else starving and living in poverty. Just ask anyone who has actually lived under it. Breitbart says open borders, globalism, tribalism are reminiscent of Rome's collapse. Victor Davis Hanson, historian, professor, and author of The Dying Citizen, How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. He said this on Wednesday, that open borders and globalism and tribalism are contributing to the collapse of the United States, which is reminiscent of the fall of Rome. He said this on SiriusXM's Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow. He remarked, every nation that has survived has had borders that were defensible and clear. And the idea that they have their own space to inculcate their language or traditions or customs then enhance their constitution. Without that, it's just short of a migratory 5th century AD Rome where people come across the Danube and destroy the nation state. The growth of identity politics, he said, predicated on ethnicity and race, Hanson warned, could contribute to an American collapse if unchecked. He stated, identity politics is another natural human pathology where we identify by our superficial appearance, and when we start to do that, we regress to something like the former Yugoslavia or Rwanda. And that trajectory will be in our future unless we stop it and realize we, the United States, are a very rare, multiracial democracy that's given up, each of us has given up, our primary identities as race or ethnicity and have become instead Americans. American values of civic nationalism transcend ethnic and racial lines, Hansen went on to say. He said citizenship is under attack. Natural organic forces suggest that the middle class is no longer central to the American experience, and we can see that whether it be declining wages or increasing student debt up to 1.7 trillion in aggregate, or people marrying later or having children later, buying homes later. It is the strangulation of the middle class, which is always essential to citizenship. He went on to say he thinks Obama started a lot of this when he recreated this idea of diversity, meaning that we didn't consider class anymore. Suddenly, class didn't matter. You could be a multimillionaire Punjabi immigrant. You could own 7 ophthalmology clinics and be from South Korea. You could be Oprah. You could be Meghan Markle. But you are now a victim because you were so-called non-white and you represent 30% of the population. He continued, that polarization, I think, enticed people and encouraged them to keep going. And yet he warned the growing pursuit of manufactured victimhood among Americans to secure various advantages over others in lieu of meritorious distinctions is going to create the demise and the downfall of America. Now, there was a book written called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbons. The interesting thing about the Roman Empire, which we know is going to come back in some revived form during the tribulation period, as Daniel chapter 2 indicates, where there's going to be the toes that are pictured there mingled with clay, is going to be the ruling empire during the tribulation. We know there'll be a 10-nation federation that is whittled down to 7 that is ruled by the Antichrist. The redistribution of wealth is going to be a practice of the beast of Revelation chapter 13. But what we need to recognize is that Rome was never conquered from without. It imploded from within. And Gibbons records 5 causes of the demise, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And listen to this. It's like a checklist of American society. Number 1, what caused the decline and fall of the Roman Empire? The undermining of the dignity and sanctity of the home, which is the basis for human society. Number 2, higher and higher taxes, the spending, listen close, the spending of public money for free bread and circuses for the populace. Number 3, the mad craze for pleasure, sports becoming more and more exciting, more brutal, more immoral. The building of great armaments is number 4, when the real enemy is within. And the decay of individual responsibility. And boy, is that happening in our world today. Now, the decay of religion, faith, fading into mere form, losing touch with life, losing the power to guide the people, winds up to 5 causes of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and they are all well underway here in the United States. And listen, we need to be praying for our country. You know, the Bible was spot on in Proverbs 29:2 when it said, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. And listen, we are seeing our country doing things that aren't just foolish. They don't even make sense logically, and all this gender fluidity and all these things that are being protected that are absolute nonsense are happening right here in the good old US of A, including the undermining of the dignity and the sanctity of the home. And when you destroy the basis for human society becomes deceived and delusional, and that is happening all around us today. Now, Breitbart reports that Biden unleashes an FBI Gestapo to terrorize parents who oppose critical race theory. His fraudulency, Joe Biden's attorney general, has just announced that the FBI will be engaged to terrorize parents who oppose left-wing school board policies. All around the country, parents have been speaking out and protesting against several absurd and destructive school board policies that have been put in place to damage, sexualize, and indoctrinate children. Chief among these policies is critical race theory, which teaches children to be racist and that white people are inherently dangerous oppressors because of their skin color. Now Joe Biden is deploying the FBI, against parents who have concern about critical race theory being taught to their children. This is a remarkable and dangerous abuse of power, the article says. And the letter follows the National School Board Association's request to classify protest against these associations that are indoctrinating your kids as domestic terrorism. Parents are also opposed to anti-science mask mandates, although nothing in science supports the idea that forcing kids into filthy masks all day long does anyone any good. These fascist school boards are still imposing these mandates. And then the article says there's the sexual nonsense where kids are indoctrinated with a bunch of perversion about how men can magically transform into women, where kids who are still minors are taught about homosexuality and abortion and given sexual writing assignments. There's just an article out a couple of days ago where the schools are now having people role play, these students role play as a transgender or homosexual in order to express and understand and be taught that we are all indeed the same, no matter our sexual orientation. Now, unfortunately, too many of the government-run schools in this country have become breeding grounds for the mentally ill educators, desperate to force their warped political agendas and neurosis on our children. And now parents have had enough. And the same Joe Biden, who just yesterday said that being harassed and filmed in a public restroom is part of the process of being an elected official, is now unleashing his FBI brown shirts on parents who have the audacity to want a say in how their child is educated. Days after, again, the national organization representing school board officials lamented to the Biden administration about hate groups intimidating educational officials, Attorney General Merrick Garland directed the FBI to combat the threats of violence against administrators without citing any specific cases. Fox News picked up the story and said Biden's politicization of DOJ continues with new effort to combat threats against school boards, critics say. And Biden promised on the campaign trail that he would keep politics out of the DOJ, or the Department of Justice. President Joe Biden once again broke his campaign commitment to keep the DOJ non-political, critics say, calling Attorney General Merrick Garland's latest directive to the FBI to investigate threats of violence at school board meetings as a clear move to politicize the DOJ. On Monday, Garland directed the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices to hold meetings with federal, state, and local law enforcement leaders in the next 30 days, during which they will discuss ways to combat what the DOJ called a disturbing trend of harassments and threats against school officials. Garland's announcement came just days after the National School Board Association wrote the letter we mentioned a moment ago. Now, here's the thing. This is pushing government authoritarianism and tyranny without question. And basically, what do they expect a parent to do? When your child is being taught things that are against all the things you've taught them at home, when your child is being force-fed things that you don't want them to learn, maybe they're not even of the age where these things are an appropriate conversation, even in the educational sense. Listen, 5-year-olds don't need to be taught about human sexuality. 5-year-olds need to be out kicking the ball on the playground or shooting it through a hoop or pulling girls' hairs or kicking boys in the shins or doing all those things that 5- and 6-year-olds are supposed to be doing. They don't need to be indoctrinated by a bunch of weirdos who want to cram things down their throats that simply aren't true and are anti-God. And the politicizing of the DOJ continues to happen, and it undermines state and parental authority, according to Arizona Attorney General Mark Brinovich. So again, the Georgia Star News reporting the same thing, calling it totalitarian tyranny, and parent groups are slamming A.G. Garland for turning the FBI against their activism. And this article is interesting because it says that the Department of Justice in a press release, said that it is creating specialized training for school boards and administrators to identify threats, to report it to law enforcement, and capture and preserve evidence to aid in prosecutions. A task force is also planned that includes the department's criminal division and national security division. Now, these are all being formed against parents who don't want their kids told, whether they're someone of a darker skin tone or a brown skin tone or white, they don't want their kids being taught racism. They don't want their kids being taught about gender fluidity. They don't want their kindergartner to be taught about human sexuality. And these are the ones that are being now called the domestic terrorists. And these are the ones that the Department of Justice of the United States is teaching these administrative boards how to recognize them, to film them, to capture the evidence so they can be prosecuted for protecting their kids. Our world has lost its mind. America has lost its way. Listen, we need to remember the Bible has told us all these things are going to come to pass. Perilous times will be part of the last days. It's going to be a season of violence where the thoughts and intents of man's heart is only evil continually, as it was in the days of Noah. But the Bible told us also that this is what it's going to be like right before Jesus comes to get us. And therefore, we have every reason to keep our eyes lifted above the moment. We have to remember that we are from a city whose builder and maker is God. We are not citizens of this country or any other. We are citizens of heaven. We are going to be with the Lord forever and ever and ever, and it will be in a place where righteousness exclusively dwells. And there's nothing in the city, Revelation tells us, that causes an abomination or practices a lie. Truth will be the order of the day, and we will live in a glorified state forever and ever with the Lord. You see, if we get our eyes lowered on the moment and we take them off of eternity, it's easy to be overwhelmed by these things and forget where we're headed and where we're going and how we're going to get there, which is in a moment and a twinkling of an eye. And all I can say to that is, come get us, Lord Jesus. CBS News tells us where this is going. And that is a Texas man sentenced to 15 months in prison for spreading COVID-19 hoax on Facebook. A man who perpetuated a COVID-19 hoax on Facebook last year has been sentenced to 15 months in prison. Christopher Charles Perez was found guilty on 2 counts with which criminalized false information and hoaxes related to biological weapons, the Justice Department announced this week. Now, this is about as stupid as yelling bomb on an airplane. And obviously, this man was guilty, but obviously, this man needs some kind of help to do what he did. It says in the article that in April of 2020, 40-year-old Perez posted 2 false threatening messages on Facebook claiming he paid someone infected with COVID-19 to lick items at a grocery store in San Antonio to scare people away. A screenshot of the post was sent to Southwest Texas Fusion Center, who contacted the FBI office in San Antonio. And after further investigation, it was determined Perez's threat was false. He didn't pay anyone to intentionally spread COVID-19. Perez also admitted that it was all a fake. But think about this. He's getting a 15-month sentence, ordered to pay a $1,000 fine. And the investigation was conducted by FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, along with the Weapons of Mass Destruction personnel. Well, first of all, COVID, we now know, and at that point they knew, couldn't be spread through surface-to-surface contact. There wasn't one case documented where that's the means by which it was transmitted. It is aerosol. It's not airborne, it's aerosol, meaning it has to be transmitted through droplets, water droplets, through coughing or breathing, but it doesn't survive on the surface like it was first reported. I think some were saying it's 9-10 days that can live on the surface of a counter, which was hooey. And again, part of the scare tactics we've been experiencing. But this man is sentenced to 15 months in prison, a $1,000 fine for doing something stupid, which opens the door for the prosecution of others who are spreading false information. And we've seen those bastions of wisdom on social media, the fact checkers who wouldn't know a fact if it hit them in the face. And I know I say that a lot, but we need to, because it's true. And they're fact checking everything. And therefore, this man who spread false information about something he didn't actually do is going to prison for it or going to jail for 15 months for it and being fined for it. So who's to say that can't happen to someone who's protesting at a school board meeting about the indoctrination of their children? This is where things are headed. And we know it's going to reach its zenith during the tribulation period, when all who are deemed to be enemies of the beast of Revelation 13, or the man we call the Antichrist, are going to refuse to take a mark. And because of their refusal to take a mark, which identifies them as a worshiper of Satan who empowered the beast, they're going to be beheaded. So this has to be the mentality that goes into the tribulation, and it is the reason for people being in the tribulation, that they want those who are against their ideology to be punished severely. And even though something as simple as a parent protecting their child should be every person's right, it's now viewed as anti-globalist in its thinking and outside the progressives' ideology of what the world ought to look like. And it's happening everywhere, and there are none who are exempt, because the LA Times reports that a UCLA anesthesiologist who is vocal against COVID vaccine mandates has been escorted out of his workplace. A UCLA anesthesiologist who is vocal about his opposition to COVID-19 vaccine mandates was escorted out of his workplace on Monday for attempting to enter the building unvaccinated. In a video that he seemingly captured himself, Dr. Christopher B. Rake is seen being escorted out of the 200 UCLA Medical Plaza in Westwood by 3 individuals. This is what happens when you stand up for freedom and when you show up to work, willing to work, despite being unvaccinated. And this is the price you have to pay sometimes, he said. But what they don't realize is that I'm willing to lose everything, job, paycheck, freedom, even my life for this cause. And Rake has been vocal about his beliefs before August 29th, or on August 29th. He was recorded at an anti-vaccination rally in Santa Monica, speaking about his opposition to the August 5th California order that all healthcare workers must be vaccinated against COVID-19 by September 30th. And in opposition, Rake founded an anti-vaccination organization called the Citizens United for Freedom. And in the video, Rake tells the crowd they want to force a vaccination or medication or treatment into my body that I don't want. So they're telling me, take the jab or we'll take your job. And that's happening to tens of thousands of people all over the country. And listen, we're told, just get the vaccine. Just take the vaccine. Get the 2 shots. Well, if the 2 shots is so effective, then why are people still getting COVID who've been vaccinated with both doses of the vaccine? And what are they so worried about? I mean, obviously, this is real. We've had people within our own fellowship who've died from COVID-19. We're not saying that it's not real. It's not legitimate. But it does still, even according to the CDC's own numbers, it still has a survivability rate of over 99%. Some say as high as 99.6%. And of course, that 0.4% is a tragic loss of life. But listen, we were just in Virginia, and we, as Terry and I often do, we visited a cemetery, which we, for whatever reason, we find to be kind of a calming place, and it's enjoyable to think about. You know, who were these people? What were their lives like? Who were born in 1785 and died before the Civil War? Those who we can see between the 2 dates on their stone lived during the Civil War. What was life like for them, and all these other things? But either way, we find ourselves doing that frequently as we travel. But this particular time, we ran across 3 little headstones, and they were all maybe 18, 20 inches tall. And because of their age, it was hard to read them, but you could see somewhat clearly, at least at the end of the name, all 4 shared the same last name, and that was Matthews. And then a closer examination showed there were 2 boys and 2 girls. And then we found on the stones that they died in 1918 during and likely because of the Spanish flu. Now, there was an article that just came out yesterday that said CDC is reporting that more people have died in 2021 than died of COVID in 2020. Now, listen, this is the exact pattern that the Spanish flu followed between 1918 and 1920. Same exact pattern. The second year was a more deadly year. It even changed age groups that it was affecting more severely during that year. And this is following the same pattern. But why isn't anybody talking about this? Why isn't anybody saying, this is going to mutate out of a toxic form and even maybe a form where it doesn't cause any fatalities at all or very few. And because that's what viruses do. They mutate, sometimes upward, sometimes downward. Sometimes they become more aggressive. Sometimes they become less aggressive. But that's what happened in 1918 with the Spanish flu, which, by the way, was an H1N1 virus. And it simply mutated out of effectiveness, and it no longer was causing death. And it took a 3-year cycle, and there was a huge and tragic loss of life. Some 20% of the U.S. population was impacted by this, and the numbers are up to 50 million people died. Some say high as 100 million people died from the Spanish flu in the span of 3 years. And of course, it's horrific, but there was no vaccine. It simply went away. It mutated out of existence. Well, we don't have these kind of conversations today. It just simply is going to be with us forever, and we need to get everybody vaccinated. Now, we talk about this as well, and I want to mention a couple of stories here as we wrap things up, that in the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus made his opening statements, I like to call it the preamble, he talked about what was going to determine or be called the beginning of sorrows or the commencement of birth pangs. And he talked about false Christs and efforts to deceive. He talked about wars and rumors of wars. He talked about ethnic tensions and actual fightings between countries, kingdom rising against kingdom. He talked about famines. He talked about plagues or pestilences. And then he mentioned also, he used the Greek term, or the Bible uses the Greek term, seismos. Now, seismos obviously has a geological application, but it also can mean and can be translated as a gale or a tempest, which is an intense wind event, which obviously takes place in the atmosphere. And a gale or a tempest would indicate some type of hurricane or cyclone type product. So interesting that he made mention of those things. And we've been talking about these things in recent weeks. And we would expect to see terminology like unprecedented or record-breaking incorporated into these stories. And indeed, we're seeing that. And our next story comes from AccuWeather. And the headline says, the coldest place on Earth just had its coldest winter on record. There goes that global warming again. Unprecedented bouts of extreme heat and increased ice melting events have become the common topics of global warming worries, but in the South Pole, the opposite effects have been just as jarring in recent months, AccuWeather reports. Unlike its flashier cousin, the North Pole, which has its famous mythical holiday resident, a nod to Santa Claus, the South Pole hasn't been as directly exposed to the effects of a heating climate. While rising temperatures and melting ice shelves have caused some worry for climatologists, the South Pole has been largely spared from the effects seen at the North Pole, which has endured widespread glacial melting and was even shrouded in wildfire smoke this summer. But in the vast tundra of Antarctic ice at the South Pole, temperatures plummeted to levels never seen before. At the Amundsen South Pole Station, Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, located on the highest plateau of Antarctica, average temperatures from April to September, the continent's winter months, fell all the way down to 78 degrees below zero. That wasn't the lowest temperature. That was the average temperature. And according to data kept by the British Antarctic Society, the 2021 winter's harsh temperatures were the lowest since data has been recorded at the South Pole beginning in 1957. Now, here's another interesting story, again from AccuWeather. Listen to this. 34 inches of rain in 24 hours breaks the continental record. Parts of northern Italy are recovering from a historic deluge earlier this week that produced a new continent-wide record for rainfall over a 12-hour period and left one city with nearly a year's worth of rainfall in a day. Rosaglione, Italy, located in the Genoa province, found itself in the absolute worst of Monday's extreme rainfall. The city ended up with a mind-boggling 34.8 inches of rainfall in the course of 24 hours. The annual rainfall total for the city is just over 42 inches, which is fairly representative for the region as a whole, according to AccuWeather forecasters. And this means that Rosaglione recorded 82.9% of the average rainfall in just one day, the annual average rainfall in just one day. In order to record rainfall totals that extreme, rainfall rates had to be extraordinary, even record-breaking. And I love what one senior meteorologist, Adam Dowdy, said. That's ridiculous amount of rainfall. And outside of Rosiglione's new records, 2 other Italian cities reported records on Monday. Now, here's why I wanted to set this up. This is, we've got the United Nothing out there who's telling everybody what they ought to be doing. And especially, the educational arm, the science and educational arm that actually seems to be anti-science and anti-education. And here we've got another portion of the agency, the UN agency, looming of a global water crisis. Climate change is posed to result in a worldwide water crisis, and international institutions and governments have not done enough to prepare, according to a report released Tuesday by the World Meteorological Organization. The report determined that as of 2018, some 3.6 billion people did not have sufficient access to water at least 1 month every year. This number will surpass 5 billion by 2050, according to the report. Much of the crisis can be attributed to the rapid reduction of terrestrial water, which includes ice and snowpack. Terrestrial storage has fallen at an annual rate of 1 centimeter, with much of the loss occurring in Antarctica and Greenland. Didn't we just read that they're not seeing that in Antarctica? Yes, we did, from AccuWeather, by the way. Risks have grown beyond water storage loss, according to the research. Flooding-related disasters. Now listen to this. Listen how ridiculous this is. Flooding-related disasters have spiked by 134% in the past 2 decades, or since the turn of the century, with Asia seeing the biggest death tolls and economic losses. Did you catch that? Flooding-related disasters have spiked by 134%. Droughts, meanwhile, have increased by 29% since the beginning of the century, with the bulk of the drought-related deaths occurring in Africa. Did you catch that? Flood-related events have increased by 134%, and drought-related events have increased by 29%, yet there's a looming global water crisis. Listen, this just reminds us that truth is basically out the window these days by people who should have a sense of responsibility to report accurate information. But listen, climate change is the tool by which the equalization of wealth across the world, the equality of outcome, the equality of income is going to be spread throughout the globe. I mean, they're talking about finding countries and paying a surcharge for a carbon footprint that's larger than your allowable amount, and you ought to transfer that money to a poorer country so they can become an industrialized country and they can create a bigger carbon footprint. The whole thing is just absolutely ridiculous, and it's authored by the devil, and it is going to reach its zenith during the tribulation period when there is indeed a small group of people that are going to rule the world. Their number will be 8. And I got news for Gates and Soros and these other people that think that they're going to be sitting in driver's seats when the Great Reset happens. The Antichrist will have nothing to do with that. He's going to be in charge. He's going to be in control. And they'll be, if they happen to survive the rapture and the events of the tribulation, they will be nowhere to be found, at least in his administration. He is going to run the world, and the world is being prepared for a single source of authority to take over and tell all the rest of the people on the planet what to do. And I did say all the rest of the people on the planet intentionally, because all born-again people aren't going to be on the planet during the tribulation. So we need to keep that in mind, as I said. We need to make sure that we're remembering where we're going when we experience the things that are happening all around us. Is it discouraging and disappointing to see these things happen? Yes. Should it make us angry that they're indoctrinating our kids? Absolutely. Should it call us to action? Yes, it should. We need to stand up and fight for our kids. And listen, we're not talking about resorting to violence and those kind of things, but we have other ways to make our voices known. And listen, Christian, don't be staying home on voting day. Get out there and make your voice heard. And listen, to any who are sitting under someone who's telling you that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, they need to take a read through Romans chapter 13, because those in political places of power, those specifically with responsibilities to punish evil, are called God's ministers. Now listen, why would God ordain human government and then want people who don't believe in him to run it? Christians need to be involved in this, and our voices need to be heard. And we can't just sit there silently and let the devil ransack our schools and all the other things that he has done basically at will over this past century and a little more. But we can still stand up. We still need to make sure that our voices are heard. Now, remember, our primary mission as Christians is to tell people about Jesus. That's what we're here for. That's what God has left us here for. I mean, think about it. I've thrown this out to the church a few times, and I'll share it with you. God's primary purpose is to rescue the human soul. And then he unites the human soul with a glorified, what was once a lowly body, with a Christ-like body at the resurrection. And we then have immortal incorruptibility forever, and allows us to live in the eternal realm without all the consequences of the fall and the sin of man. And we're headed for that particular place, and we're going to have that experience in a moment and a twinkling of an eye, and things are going to get radically better, radically fast, and they will forever be in that, will be in that situation. So as we look at the things going on around us now, as we experience the things that we're all disappointed and discouraged by, we have to remember that heaven is our home, and that we're here, and God left us here for only one reason. If he left us here, he left us here to save souls and tell people about Jesus. Since our soul is his primary desire to save, and then Scripture says, all souls are mine. And the Lord speaking, if his desire is to save our souls, and when we are born again, our souls are saved, why didn't he just take us to heaven immediately? Because he has something for us to do. What is it that he has for us to do? Tell people about Jesus. How will they hear on him of whom they have not heard? How will they hear without a preacher? And how will the preachers preach unless they're sent? And how can they come to faith in Christ without hearing the word of God? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. That is the only reason we're still here. Now, there are secondary things that we can and should do. We need to fight against abortion. We need to fight against the indoctrination of our children. We need to stand up for what is right and true, and we need to stand against evil, and we need to fight for the unborn and the innocent, and care for the widows and orphans and all the other things. But listen, friends, we are here to tell people about the Lord. Tell people about Jesus this week. Make sure that somebody knows that you are his child, and you've been bought back by and through the blood of Jesus Christ from the law of sin and death. And they can have that hope too, in order to survive with their mind intact these perilous times in which we now live. Parents out there, good parents who may not know the Lord but love their kids, need to hear about the hope of heaven. They're worried about their kids. You need to be able to tell them, and we need to be telling them, the Bible said it was going to be like this. And listen, when you begin to speak, and what we have to remember as Christians, this is what distinguishes the Bible from every other religious writing, and that's prophecy. And when you start saying that 3,500 years ago, the Bible said this was going to happen, and we're now watching it happen, that gives a credibility to the book that no other religious book has. And that's why in Revelation, we're told that the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. It's what gives breath into prophecy. Jesus was prophesied that he was going to come, and he did. It's prophesied he'd be born in Bethlehem, and he was. Prophesied that he would be beaten with many stripes, and he was. Prophesied that his visage, his appearance would be marred more than any man, and it was. Prophesied that he would be buried amongst the rich, and he was. Prophesied that he was going to rise again, and he did. And he ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of majesty on high, living daily as intercession for you and I. People need to know this all around us, and we need to be telling them. I know where this is going, because that's what everybody is wondering. It's going exactly to the place the Bible said it was. So be bold in these last days. Remember, this world is not our home. Tell people about Jesus. Well, a lot of people don't like it today. Well, some people never have and never will. And listen, this is something I think we need to realize from the parable of the soils. Our responsibility is to sow seed, not bear success. You just scatter the seed. Jesus in that parable said, you know what? Some, are going to have an enthusiastic response, but then persecutions related to the word of God are going to come up and they're going to walk away saying, no, this isn't what I signed up for. Well, they're just going to fall on hard and stony ground, not going to be receptive at all. But there is going to be those times where the seed falls on fertile soil and something pops up that is fruitful and eternal. And what a blessed thing to be able to play a part in that by sharing Christ with other people. So that's it for this week. And remember, next Thursday night, Pastor Mike McIntosh will be sitting across the table from me or beside me, and we'll be talking, as we did for many years, about world events as they relate to Bible prophecy. So make sure you tune in. And with that said, our customary greeting from the Jesus Day, or our closing salutation, I should say, is we'll see you here, there, or in the air. God bless you.